Hi, my name is Seth Whitehead, and I'm the Executive Director of the Illinois Petroleum Resources Board. Today we're visiting with Jerry Robinson, the Technical Manager of Franklin Well Service. Today Jerry is going to show us the composition of hydraulic fracturing fluid used on 90% of the wells completed using hydraulic fracturing here in the Illinois Basin. Fracking occurs after drilling has been completed and involves pumping fluid, typically at least 99% water and sand with an additional mixture of chemical additives, into the target formation at pressure in order to open up small fractures and allow oil and gas to flow through the rock. Fracking is used to complete 95% of new oil and natural gas wells in the United States. Although the process has been conducted millions of times across the United States for many decades, a widespread misunderstanding of fracking remains. Contrary to some of the scary claims that have been made over the past several years, fracturing fluid is not dangerous. The 1% or less share of frac fluid that is composed of chemical additives is primarily guar beans and borate, which is a fancy word for laundry detergent. Today, Jerry will demonstrate exactly what the 1% or less of chemical additives in frac fluid used here in Illinois is composed of. Jerry has used the frac fluid that he's about to demonstrate on thousands of well completions here in the Illinois Basin. Jerry, thanks for taking the time to come by and talk to us today.
Thank you, Seth. I am Jerry Robinson, the Technical Manager of Franklin Well Service. And what I'm going to show you is what we do almost on a daily basis and have done it since the 1950s in the Illinois Basin. There's been fracturing treatments going on in the Illinois Basin since the early 50s. The first ones, I think, was done in 1947 out in Oklahoma by Halliburton. And the fluids and the system has changed tremendously, but most of them has always been a base with water. And what I'm going to show you today is that, because that's what we use 99, almost 100% of the time is water. I mean, we don't use much of anything else anymore. But we basically start with just water. This is fresh water, tap water I got out of the sink. It's got a pH of 7. Which is neutral pH, what your body fluids, most of that are. And it's probably hard to see, but the bottom right hand color here on this is a 7, and that's what my water pH shows. And then what we're going to do, we're going to take the gel. The gel is basically just guar gum bean, and they grind it up to a fine powder like face. Almost like talcum powder, and it basically does the same thing as what like cornstarch or something does. You add it to water, it thickens the water, gives it some viscosity. It's like soybeans or anything, only the guar bean has a tendency to increase viscosity better and stabilize better than what soybeans does. They're actually working on a process up at the University of Illinois that could use soybeans, but guar bean by far does a better job at doing it. And what I'm going to do is just add about 2 grams of this guar to the water, and then shake it and stir it up and hydrate the gel into the water, and it will build a viscosity of around 19 or 20 centipoise. Centipoise is just a measuring of the viscosity. Like I said, water has a viscosity of 1 by itself. It takes a couple minutes here to get this hydrated, to get it gelled. But it just goes on, and it's starting to do it already. A little bit more. But we use this when we want to do and we use this all the time as just what we call a linear gel. In the fracturing business, it's just linear means it's just straight water and gel. No other additives other than the sand that we do. We do put a bit of a breaker. A breaker is just another chemical we add, very small amounts. And the ones we use is the enzyme breaker, which is little bugs that will biodegrade the gel molecules and eat them once we put them down in the well. And so it breaks the viscosity back. That's why we call it a breaker. Okay. Now basically, I'll show you. It's hard to see, but it's just slick and slimy now. And you can see it kind of pull apart on my fingers where it's got that viscosity now, where water wouldn't do that. It's just, you can see it stirring there between my fingers. Nothing hazardous about it. It's all biodegradable. You can eat this stuff. Most of the guar beans are grown over in India. And this is what we're going to do. When we do a regular frac job down with a linear gel, that gives us real thin, maybe 1/10 of an inch crack in the rock that allows us to carry sand out there. That's what the viscosity is for, to carry the sand. As you're pumping it down the well and it turns the corner to go out in the formation, Mother Nature, gravity takes over. And when you turn that corner, if you don't have enough viscosity, that sand will have a tendency to fall with gravity. Just like if you throw the rock in a bucket of water or a bucket of this gelled water, it would slow it down, the gelled water would, over water, but it would still fall to the bottom, sink to the bottom. So we put this, the higher the viscosity, the better chance you got turning the corner. And when we got a higher porosity or a higher permeable zone we want to frac, then we, instead of using a linear gel, we use the same base, but we add boric acid or borax. And that's what this here container is. But it's basically just borax, 20 mule team borax soap, laundry detergent. We use a higher concentrate than what this is, but it's the same thing. But we use it to complex the linear gel to increase the viscosity. Like I said, the linear gel has 20 pounds per 1,000. That means 20 pounds of this gel to 1,000 gallons of water, and will give us that 19 or 20 centipoid viscosity. Then when we complex it with the 20 multi borax, it will give us about a 1,500 or so centipoid viscosity, a lot thicker. Let me mix this up now. I don't know if you can hear the difference in the sound when I was shaking, but it did it pretty quick. Now what we got is we call a crosslink frac. Same amount of gel, the 20 pounds per 1,000. Then we add this boric acid, this borax to it, at about 1 to 1.5 gallons per 1,000 gallons. Very little of it. And we make this gel, crosslink gel. And now it's got about 1,500 centipoid viscosity instead of the 19 or 20. And that's what we call the tongue test. It kind of hangs out like a big tongue. You can actually put it in your hand. And it's just a big blob. Kind of like what the kids use their goop or the slime that you could buy for your kids. That's all it is, a crosslink fluid. But there's nothing hazardous to it. It doesn't hurt you. The only difference, we're using the guar bean and the borax to do it. And then if we wanted to, we normally put the breaker, on a linear gel, we use about 5 ounces per 1,000 gallons. On these crosslinks, we use about 10 ounces per 1,000 gallons of that breaker solution I was talking about, the enzyme breaker, the little bugs. And it'll break it in 3 or 4 hours after we pump it in the well, and it breaks back to water. And that's why we call it a breaker. But if for some reason they wanted to break it quick, usually don't, but for this situation, for this trial, I'm going to break it back to the gel real quick. I'm going to break the crosslink by just lowering the pH. So what I've got here is uranic acid, just like you use at your swimming pool to adjust the pH in your swimming pool. I'm going to use muriatic acid to lower the pH back, because the pH, like I showed you to start with, was water, with a pH of 7. Let me do that first here. Now, I'm going to have about a 9, pH of 9, if I can get it in the gel. Get to soak up a little bit here. It's kind of a dry gel, so not very wet now. But it's about pretty much of a 9 there. The third one from your left on top there, that's what the pH is now. So we cross-linked it, all we did is increase the pH to complex it with the borax, increases the pH. But if we had to, we could break it back to the gel with just some muriatic acid, like you use in your swimming pool. It's nothing to be afraid of. In fact, what you buy at your pool store for your pool is usually 32% muriatic acid. This is only about 15%. So what you use in your pool is a lot stronger, so you don't want to get it in your eyes or on your skin, but you don't use that much of it to change the pH, and I don't either. Now I'm back to the linear gel. It broke the crosslink. And all I did was lower the pH. Back, still a few blobs there. Didn't get it broke all the way. And that's the basic fluid that we use in the fracs in Illinois Basin. And a lot of them out west, and you hear about slick water fracs. Slick water, what we used to use was 15 pounds of this per 1,000 gallon of fluid years ago. Nowadays, they got a liquid version that use about a half a gallon to 3/4 of a gallon per 1,000 gallon of water. Very little chemical. And slick water is just that. They call it a friction reducer because it just slicks the water up like this, but not as high viscosity. You only need maybe a 5 or 6 viscosity centipoise for the friction reducer that you use for those slick water fracs. And then they add sand, like we do. So there's not much to it either. It's just very low chemicals. It's less than 1% of the total fluid pumped.
Jerry's now going to take some time to answer some frequently asked questions about hydraulic fracturing. Jerry, as we covered earlier in this presentation, hydraulic fracturing is used to complete 95% of new oil and gas wells in the United States, and a similar percentage here in the Illinois Basin as well. Folks may be wondering, why is hydraulic fracturing sometimes necessary to complete a well?
Well, when they drill the wells, I mean, they find the oil and there's the gas. In Illinois Basin, it's mostly oil. And there's a few gas wells, most of it's oil. And to produce enough to pay for itself, you have to fracture them. The formations by themselves, once you drill them and open them up, will not produce enough volume to make them commercially productive. And if you did that way without fracturing, you'd have to have probably 10 or 20 wells to each one that you frack to make the same volume of oil. I mean, you have to fracture because you get damage in the formation and the matrix of the rock from the drilling and the cementing to isolate the zones. And you have to frack through that damage to get it back out into the formation to make them commercially profitable.
What is the difference between the hydraulic fracturing that's done here in the Illinois Basin and the high volume hydraulic fracturing that's done in the big shale plays like, for instance, Texas and North Dakota?
Size is everything. I mean, out there in those big shale plays that they're doing, they'll use millions of gallons of water and millions of pounds of sand and high rates, because they've got 5,000 or 10,000 foot of formation that they're fracturing in a whole bunch of different stages. In Illinois Basin, most of our wells are vertical, And we have a whole bunch of little bitty zones at different layers, different elevations, depths. And where we might have a 6 or 4 foot or 8 foot or a 10-foot zone, you can't put millions of gallons of water or millions of pounds of sand. So our average frac job in Illinois is probably somewhere what we call a 210 tank frac. 210 barrel tank. It holds about 8,000 gallons. We'll use about 7,000 gallons of that and put 8 to 10,000 pounds of sand in those little zones. I mean, yeah, we do some bigger ones, maybe 500 barrel or 1,000 barrel. And we do some other jobs, but majority of them by far is those little 210 tank fracs.
We've seen this 1,000 times over the last 10 years, the claim that fracking chemicals are secret. Is that true? Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, well, there's some chemicals that some companies will say have proprietary additives so they keep their competition not knowing what's in it. But the basic chemicals like the gel that I showed, the borate, they're all readily available, the SDS sheets on all of them and all the material composition. You could go on the internet from Frac Focus or Energy in Depth. They have volumes and volumes of databases with all the chemicals used in fracturing that anybody can download and get. There's nothing secret about them.
You also often read that hydraulic fracturing chemicals are dangerous, but as you showed today, most of them are completely benign. Could you talk a bit about that?
Sure, most of them are benign. They try to keep the company, they want to be as green as they could be. But there's some, even the ones that are considered dangerous, maybe that might be a little bit more reactive than what these were, like some of the surfactants or some of the other chemicals. But if you drink them straight, yeah, you're going to get sick. But there's such a small volume used, a dilution. They're down to EPA standards well below those standards when you look at the volumes of parts per million. They might use 1 or 2 gallons, like the gel we use 20 pounds per 1,000 gallon. The borate, was using 1 to 1.5 gallon per 1,000 gallon. The surfactants and some of the chemicals that they say, are hazardous, in a raw form, I wouldn't want to drink it. But there's such a small volume used, 1 or 2 gallon per 1,000 gallon of water, that the parts per million it's so diluted down that you're not going to get sick.
We've also got a graphic up on our website, iprb.org. It shows an activist distributed a graphic to some schools in West Virginia that shows hydraulic fracturing occurring just below the freshwater table and the fractures extending up into the groundwater table, which we contrast with what the reality, which the Illinois State Geological Survey released a graphic a few years ago that shows that the average Illinois well depth is 3,000 to 4,000 feet. It actually exceeds the height of the Sears Tower. I believe it's the Willis Tower now in Chicago. There aren't any high volume horizontal wells in Illinois, but that's actually even greater depth than the average vertical well in Illinois. So basically in reality, where hydraulic fracturing occurs, there's thousands of feet of impermeable rock separating the fracture zone, the pay zone, from water tables. So that's kind of a long setup, but basically, Jerry, what's your response to activists, keeping the ground folks who claim that hydraulic fracturing and frac chemicals can contaminate groundwater from the depth of the well?
If the well is drilled and segmented right through, it's impossible. You cannot frac through all the different bedding planes where the formation that you're doing the frac down, that's 3,000 foot. But it's impossible to break through all of them barriers. The rock mechanics involved, the horsepower that would take the power, you can't get there. I said most of our fracs, we usually pump 400 or 500 gallon a minute, 10, 12 barrel a minute. and we use somewhere around 650 or 700 horsepower to do that. Our bigger jobs, yeah, we've done some, maybe we had 2,000 horsepower. You can't bust that much rock, and you don't bust it up anyway. You're all causing little cracks. We call them fractures, but they're just little bitty fractures that's maybe a tenth of an inch. On the linear gel system, on the crosslinks, you might get a 1/4 inch wide. And we just try to propagate them out away from the wellbore, and then you get some little ones going off the sides. But normally when you initiate a frac, you start that crack going, you go up to your barriers and it stops above your lower barrier, and then you start progressing outward away from the wellbore. Unless you put so much rate and pressure, they call it net pressure, to put too much pressure on the barriers above or below you to break through that. And if you did, it would go in that next zone above or below, but it could not go to a second one, because then it's exponential. The farther away from that frac where it initiated, it's exponential. The farther away you get, the more power it takes to bust through the next barrier. So yeah, it's possible you could get through one little bitty bedding plane right next to you. But other than that, if it's a weak barrier, you would. But other than that, it's impossible to go anywhere else. It's impossible, physically.
It's hyperbole, and it's not scientific, period.
It's not scientific at all.